My name is Doug Johnson. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit California Invasive Plant Council, and I am one of the hosts today. We have some help from colleagues with the University of California's Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources, who are joining with Calipsy on presenting these invasive species lunchtime webinars for 2023, excuse me, as part of the California Invasive Species Action Week, which is put on by the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there are lots of activities happening this week, so you can check their website and see those. This webinar series has been going for, gosh, I don't know, is this the 5th year? And all of the previous webinars from previous years are available online. And this webinar, like the others, is being recorded, and the recordings will be put up next week of all of this week's talks. So we do have today's talk and one more tomorrow. Tomorrow's Dr. Brenda Gruhl talking about invasive species in the San Francisco Bay and estuary, and that ought to be really interesting. Let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Chris McDonald is somebody that I've had the pleasure of working with for over a decade now, and he is one of our very valuable UC cooperative extension experts who cover invasive plants, among other things. And so as a natural resource advisor for Southern California, Chris has his hands in a lot of pots and is expert on a lot of things, including this early detection and rapid response that we're going to hear about. So Chris, let me pass it over to you and let you share your screen and take it away.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for that introduction. It has been fun working with you for over a decade now. All right, can you see my screen and hear me just fine?
Yep, looks great.
All right, thank you. Okay, so as you all got correct on the poll, we're going to be talking today about early detection and rapid response for invasive plants in Southern California. I'm based in Southern California, so most of this talk will be focusing on Southern California species. However, the principles in the talk apply to pretty much wherever you are. So I'm going to start with this really scary big red graph here in the left side. This is the invasion curve. And we're looking at, there are generally 4 stages of when a new invasive species is discovered anywhere in the world. There's kind of 4 things that happen once it goes. But the biggest thing is once it's introduced, the population starts to kind of slowly expand. And then once it starts to get big enough, that population starts to exponentially grow and really covers a lot of area and makes it much more difficult to control. So as the area infested increases, the control costs also increase. But the 4 big points in this is that before, there's a lot of steps we can take to prevent a species from coming in. If the populations are small enough, we can try and eradicate it. Once we start seeing that exponential growth, we're really stuck with containment issues. And then once it starts to get widespread, we're really looking at trying to protect sensitive species or protect special places, which we're calling asset-based protection. And if the red graph is too scary, well, then there's a clear one over here that's in green, so it looks a little scary, but it's all the same principle that these invasive species arrive and spread and cause problems. And so just to make sure we're all on the same point today, I'm going to be identifying between weeds, pests, and invasive species. And in my mind, there's kind of a hierarchy of problematic plant species. Because I'm a plant ecologist, I work on plants, but this also applies to invasive organisms. So at the bottom of our chart here, we have weeds, and those are kind of loosely defined as plants that are out of place. They're growing where they're not wanted, and they're generally the least aggressive in this kind of small hierarchy here. Pest species are organisms that are causing some type of damage. Sometimes that damage can be large, sometimes the damage can be small. So think of things like termites. Can be very costly to get rid of termites, but think of other things like, so there are some pests of crops that cause minor damage. And then when we talk about invasive, we're talking about those non-native species, so that they're not, their home is not in California, but they're from somewhere else, and they're causing some sort of harm, be it agricultural, economic, or environmental harm. So it's a species that's been transported, in our case, to California, and we know that it's causing harm. And these are generally the most aggressive plants that are out on the landscape. And so not all weeds are invasive, but all invasive plants are weeds, if that makes sense. So one of the things that I specialize in is emerging invasive plants. And these are the invasive plants that are on the very low end of that invasion curve that I showed you in the bright red there. These are the things that have just started to invade California, or in some cases, North America. And so I like to tell people, like, imagine for some of these species that are widespread across the US or North America. So we have Johnson grass, widespread across most of the warmer climate in the US. We have cheatgrass, which is found across, I think, all 50 states, except maybe Florida. And then we also have ripgut brome, which is found in every single county of California. So imagine if we could go back to the first introduction of some of these worst invaders, and we could rip that first population out of the ground. Like, that would be a time machine. As a plant person, that would be a time machine that I would invest in, to not have cheatgrass or yellow star thistle or Bermuda grass in California. That would be amazing. But we don't live in that world. And I want to add that there's tons of studies like this, but here's a relatively well-known one from Sebens in 2017. And we know that there are new invasive species being introduced to California every single year, but also globally. And so the first step in that invasive species curve, as I mentioned, is prevention. And we really want to try to prevent them from entering, which is one of the reasons why we have these California inspection stations at our border crossings, is to try and keep, in this case, pests of agriculture from spreading into the state and causing a problem. But what we can see here in this middle graph is we can see the new plant introductions to North America. And so even though it was peaking in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we're still looking at somewhere between 50 and 100 new plant introductions to North America every year. And that introduction rate has started to plateau, but it is still relatively high, and unfortunately for us, I think a little too high. So when working on these emerging invasive plants, I think it's important to remember that some of the new and emerging invasive weeds, this 50 to 100 or so that will be invading North America, and California gets a couple every year. These are plants that will be widespread in the future. And they were recently introduced, or they're currently in California, but we just haven't found them yet, or they're going to be introduced to California in a few short years. And so I think 2 slides ago, I talked about how it would be great to have a time machine to be able to go back into the past and stop cheatgrass from coming in. But we are the time machines that people in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years will be wishing for. And so I think when I think about it in that sense, it puts a new responsibility on me that for future Californians, we are the ones who can try and solve these problems. So what do? We do early detection and rapid response. It was in the title of my talk. I think you'll be shocked if I wasn't going to talk for the rest of the talk about EDRR. And so EDRR, the long story short of EDRR is we need to stop these new weeds from reproducing. And while that sounds really, really easy, just stop them from spreading, it is much easier to say than to do. And I'm going to get into a lot of the reasons why. But to make sure, again, we're all on the same page, EDRR is a set of long-term practices used to find new weeds, assess those new weeds that have been discovered, and treat the highest risk weeds when those populations are small so we can prevent an even greater infestation. So again, we are the time machines that people in the future want us to have. And so again, if I get back to this invasion curve, we are trying to get in this box here of eradication when things are small, when they're easily contained, when hopefully they cost less than millions of dollars to try and eradicate them. If you aren't as familiar with EDRR, because it is a somewhat niche topic, many of you are probably familiar with integrated pest management, and nearly all of the land managers that I work use an integrated pest management plan. So I'm going to use integrated pest management as kind of our benchmark to compare it to EDRR. And I even brought up the IPM plan for the Riverside County Office of Education. So even school districts have IPM plans. This is pretty common. And so IPM is a process of managing pests, in our case weeds, that focuses on the long-term prevention of pests. And we're monitoring those pests for damage. And then we're using a variety of management techniques to try and reduce or eliminate those pests when they're causing damage, when they're not allowing us to meet our targets or our goals. So here's a quick little two-step model of a part of an IPM program where we have a garden and they're growing tomatoes and there's somebody hoeing out the weeds, and then they also have a cute little baby sheep, and that's also eating down the weeds as well. So again, you can see that there's two different ways of controlling the weeds in this garden. And IPM is a process where we're working in a circle and we're constantly trying to update ourselves. So we have our goals and targets, we're identifying those pests, we're figuring out what control techniques we can be using. We're then developing and implementing our management plan. Like in the previous slide, I showed you using hula hose or scuffle hose or using cute little sheep. And then we're monitoring and assessing those management techniques. Did they work? Did they not work? And then we're refining our plan, adapting it, so then we can get back to trying to make sure we can reach our goals and targets. So if you're a land manager, what would an IPM plan look like on the landscape? So let's say you want to have River City and sage scrub or some sort of coastal sage scrub at your site. Your pests might be annual grasses. You might have annual mustards, tumbleweeds, and gophers on the site. So then you're going to assess your control techniques. Maybe you're going to mulch around the native plants to keep the annual grasses down. You're going to hula hose some of the larger weeds. Maybe you'll spot spray some treatments for some really aggressive weeds, and maybe set up some sort of gopher traps. So then you have a plan. Now that you've assessed the techniques, you're going to implement the plan, and then you're going to assess whether that plan worked. And maybe the mulch wasn't thick enough. Maybe there's a lot of rainfall, so it all washed down the hill. Maybe your weeding wasn't frequent enough. You underestimated how aggressive some of these weeds are, but maybe the gopher traps worked. So then you're going to refine the plan and then see if that refining the plan still correlates with the goals you have, and then work again in this circle, repeating this IPM process, because IPM is a process. So here's a list of many weed management techniques that you might be using when you're using IPM. And so the core part of IPM is that when you're stacking these treatments or when you're integrating them, that's one part of IPM. But if you're only stacking these treatments, then you're only doing one part of IPM, because IPM also works with, incorporates long-term prevention, and you're monitoring those pests for damages. And that monitoring will tell you when you need to treat when those pests are causing damage. So just because you're stacking those treatments doesn't mean you have a full broad IPM program. So now we're going to kind of get into how IPM is different from early detection rapid response. So I think most of you probably understand, what IPM is, and EDRR is a little bit different. And so here we have a weed that's only found in one spot of all of Southern California, and this was actually the first invasion in California, this weed, versus an IPM program, which I'm using my cute little sheep picture. So again, I talked about the definition of EDRR, talked about the definition of IPM, underlined things so it's a little bit more clear. But some of the two major differences are that in EDRR, we're using the most effective treatments. We're trying to prevent an even greater infestation. And so that prevention means that we are not eliminating pests when they're causing damage. We are eliminating pests to prevent even more damage from occurring in the future. So we want to have zero pests, zero weeds present on the landscape when we're incorporating an EDRR program. The other big difference between IPM and EDRR is the population size of the target. In an EDRR program, we want to control weeds when those populations are small. If you have 10,000 acres of a weed, that's going to be really difficult to try and manage that and eradicate it. That's probably closer to a containment issue. But with IPM, you can work with large populations of pests and assess when they're causing damage. So again, these are two crucial differences between EDRR and IPM that sets them apart, but is really important because it narrows down what type of treatments you can use in an EDRR program versus what type of treatments you can use in an IPM program. So I'm going to focus the rest of this talk on several Southern California EDRR species that highlights how EDRR works. And for most of this, I'm going to be actually talking about how EDRR is not working. But I want to show that EDRR covers at least 7 practices, and that IPM, it's like a cycle. So I like to start at the top center. And so EDRR involves some sort of education and scouting as somebody on the field looking for your weed. The next step in EDRR is detection. Can you find it? It is relatively easy to find yellow star thistle growing in a grassland. It is really, because it's 5 feet tall and has yellow flowers that have 2-inch spines on them, but it's really difficult to find a grass, a specific small, rare grass that is newly invasive growing in a grassland. So we talk about finding needles in a haystack. Imagine trying to find hay in a haystack of a different type of hay. That's where detection has a really big issue. Then you need to identify what species do you have. Then you need to report that to somebody who's in charge, and that can be a problem in some cases. Who is in charge? Who do you report to? Is this your supervisor? Is this the ag commissioner? Is it the California Department of Food and Agriculture? Then once you have identified it and you've reported it, the next step is to assess what the risk is of that species invading your site or California or North America, depending on what's going on. And then the second issue is, can you stop it? If those seeds are easily dispersed and blow in the wind, that can be a problem for trying to contain it. If it's a species that has large seeds that fall close to the ground near the parent plant, that might be a lot easier to contain. Then you need to do something. You need to manage those weeds on the landscape. So there's all these steps that have to happen before you go out and start pulling weeds or killing them. And then, of course, we want to assess whether management's working. And then we get back to education and scouting. Are there new populations out there that we've missed? And so this EDRR, like IPM, is a cycle. I just want to show this slide really quickly to show that there's a whole bunch of steps in EDRR, and a fully developed model. It contains lots of these steps, but I think these 7 steps that I've shown here are about a good start for most people to be at. But like I said, I do this a lot, so I like to think about it in kind of these complex terms. And so again, while IPM and EDRR are both processes and they look kind of from the outside similar, they're not actually the same thing. There's several steps here. So on the right chart, the left side of the right chart, these 3 steps are both similar in IPM and EDRR, where you have this response assessment feeding back into the risk and practicality of removing the species and then managing it. But the whole right side of this right chart is steps that are only found in early detection rapid response. One of the main points between IPM and EDRR is once a species becomes common, it is usually no longer an EDRR target. So for example, Sahara mustard is widespread across southwestern North America and including many parts of Southern California. it is not an EDRR species anymore. It's an IPM species. IPM also may not focus on early detections. So even though you have an IPM plan, you might not have people out on the landscape who are looking for brand new weeds that are on your site. Oftentimes IPM is focusing on restoration or weed prevention, or most often endangered and threatened species populations. And on top of that, IPM might not focus on developing the management plan necessary to go from early detection to rapid response. So you've seen it, great, but do you have the resources? Do you have the capacity to be able to survey this population and to try and kill as many as 100% of the weeds on the site as possible? And so I want to say that both of these processes are really hard. EDRR is hard, and I think it's a little bit harder than IPM because you have so many steps and because it's a high-risk scenario. You have something brand new to possibly North America invading your site, and you want to stop it from spreading. So I'm going to talk about for a while here about Volutaria, desert knapweed, Volutaria tubuliflora, which is a great example of what is not EDRR, but in many steps along the way, we just didn't know that. So I'm going to talk about this in chronological order, which I think is the most fun way to tell this story, although it doesn't make the most logical sense, but it's all going to come together in the end. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. And we're all here to have fun, right? So the first known report of Volutaria was in Upper Newport Bay in 1987, and Bob DeRuff, who was kind of an amateur botanist, discovered this species. So looking at this kind of 7 steps that I have for EDRR, Volutaria 1987, we had education and scouting. Bob DeRuff found the species. But actually, Bob reported it as a little known Centaurea species, and it was misidentified. So it wasn't first reported as Volutaria, it was reported as a relatively unknown Centaurea species, which makes sense because Centaureas are also knapweeds. And it was 1987, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He didn't have the internet and didn't have iNaturalist or CalFlora or many of the other identification tools. So you know, not a big deal. But just to be correct, this was the first time the plant was documented, but it wasn't identified correctly. And he took some pictures of it. So we got a detection as well. He saw the species in 1987 in Newport Bay, but he didn't collect a sample of this species until March 2003. This was 16 years later. And again, on that herbarium specimen, it was incorrectly identified as Centaurea muricata, this little unknown Centaurea. But he wrote it down on the voucher that it was an uncommon annual. Several plants are found here across the bay at Big Canyon as early as 1987. So he at least told us on his specimen voucher that he did find this species in 1987, 16 years earlier. But he didn't tell anyone else, as far as we know, that he found this species. There was no reporting to let anyone know. He didn't sound the alarm bells. And so this is a really great lesson for all of you who are land managers or who are finding new weeds, is to try and help other people know about these weeds and to identify those weeds. So the question, if you're a land manager, the question is, are you receiving from your staff pictures of the whole plant, leaves that are close up, the fruits or the flowers, if you can, and a close up? And if you have those 3 or 4 pictures, most people will be able to get a pretty good idea of what that species is. And then send those pictures off to somebody who might be responsible for trying to figure out whether this is a new species in California or just something that's new to you. So now let's skip ahead into 2010. In the winter of 2010, 2 botanists, R.T. Hawk and Tom Chester, were on a hike in Borrego Springs, and they found this unusual plant that was growing in the foothills, and they weren't sure what it was. They returned later in the season to try and find the plant again, and it was missing. So they didn't take a photo of it. They didn't take any specimens of it. It was just a plant that somehow disappeared. So again, there's this second opportunity where we could have known something. Then, unbeknownst to everyone else, in spring of the same growing season, Anza Borrego Desert State Park called me up to see this unusual plant that was growing in Borrego Springs. It was relatively sparse, spread out over a few hundred acres, growing like a weed. We could identify it to the kind of Centaria group of star thistles, knapweeds, but none of us who were looking at the plant in April 2011 knew what it was. But we were kind of all stood around and we were like, yeah, somebody needs to get rid of this thing. That being said, Larry Hendrickson was smarter than all of us at the meeting, and he went out there and he collected several herbarium specimens, which was wonderful. And so here's some pictures of what it kind of looked like out there. There was just kind of scattered plants here and there, big green bushy things looking like they were spreading. So for those of you who aren't in Southern California, here's Borrego Springs. Newport is off the map, but over here. In addition, Larry also found some more Volutaria plants growing about a mile away from the original infestation in Borrego Springs. And so that raised some red flags as well, that these two, to us, we thought they were two separate populations and the only two populations of this plant. So eventually we were able to, we sent in the herbarium samples to, I believe, the UCR herbarium. And then Andy Sanders at the UCR herbarium sent images to Gerhard Wagenitz, who's a German botanist, and he revised the genus Volutaria. So he was one of those experts that we were able to send samples to and try and get as close to the correct species. Our identification for this species came back as Volutaria canariensis, Canary Island knapweed, which is this little Canary Island endemic. Not much is known about it, really weird plant, which caused us to be like, how the heck did it get from the Canary Islands, small islands in the middle of the North African Atlantic, to Southern California? And so here's what Canary Island knapweed looks like, pretty-ish little plant. There's virtually no information on the ecology of this species. And again, like I said, how did it get from a not well-known place in the North Africa, in the mid-Atlantic near North Africa, to North America? We weren't sure. But at least for Borrego Springs, we had some education and scouting, we had detection, and now we had an identification by a botanist who knows his Volutaria stuff. Possibly, though. So I'm going to leave a little cliffhanger there. So in 2013, we found some more locations in Borrego Springs. And again, this was about 2 miles away from the original infestation, which was a mile away from the infestation here near the airport. So these are some widely scattered individuals in Borrego Springs. Then somebody also found a new plant in Borrego. Oh, I say, in 2013, we still didn't know about the population that Tom Chester had found in Alcoholic Pass, which was up here, which is another 3 miles from the second population we found in 2013. So we're looking at a spread of about 6 miles across town, which for those of you who are land managers, this should be starting to get a little scary for you when you're finding multiple plant populations widespread like this. But we didn't know because Tom Chester hadn't let us know that he found this goofy little plant that mysteriously disappeared. Moving ahead in 2014, we were looking at about 24 populations. So here's the original infestation, here's the airport infestation, and there's a lot more populations we're finding on the west side of town. In 2014, botanists in Chile, Sebastian Tellier, reported that they found this plant Volutaria tubuliflora invading the Atacama Desert in Chile. But this was not important to us in California because we thought our Volutaria was Volutaria canariensis. So hint, hint, you can see where I'm going with this, right? Pretty transparent in this. In 2014, the Orange County Orange County chapter of the California Native Plant Society, volunteers had discovered another unusual plant growing in the Upper Newport Bay Preserve. You can see where I'm going with this, Upper Newport Bay Preserve. Very similar place to where Bob Duruff was working in the 80s and early 2000s. And so this may have been the fourth discovery, and I'm saying discovery of this species. In spring 2015, they made some specimen vouchers, and we compared it to our vouchers, and we all said, oh, hey, look, this is that Volutaria canariensis. But no one knew that it was the incorrect ID. But it matched the Volutaria that was in Borrego Springs. So finally, in 2014, Frank Harris, who's a volunteer in Borrego Springs, comes up to me and says, you know, I'm seeing this unusual weed growing around the city, and there's a whole bunch of it out there. And so at this point in time, I remember seeing it here and there and out with Larry Hendricks in the field in 2001, but I had no idea that this weed was really spreading in Borrego Springs. And this was also when Calflora wasn't being well used, or iNaturalist wasn't being well used. So we were kind of in the dark ages trying to figure out where all these plants are growing. And then finally in 2014, again, Tom Chester and Larry Hendrickson were having a conversation, and they both were talking about this Volutaria plant, or Larry was talking about the Volutaria plant he found in 2011. It was like, you know, Tom was like, yeah, I think I saw something similar to that. And that's when all these things started to come together. So finally we were like, oh, Tom found this weird plant. And now Frank told me, you know, this plant's really getting out of control. And so we really started to increase our mapping efforts. And we found lots of new populations in 2015. Once we finally started to doing what we thought was a rapid assessment, because we had first discovered the plant in 2011. So even though it was 4 years late, that's still not a rapid assessment, but it's more rapid than I'm gonna, when I put this all together in the end. Then the next winter, when I was talking to these colleagues in Spain about their little Canary Island knapweed, they had emailed me and they're like, this doesn't match. What you've got in California isn't this Canary Island knapweed. And I was like, that's interesting. Wish I could take a field trip to the Canary Islands and see. But instead, they did the cheaper alternative of sending me pictures of Volutaria tubuliflora in the Canary Islands and their Volutaria canariensis in the Canary Islands. And they showed a close-up of the leaf, and the leaf of Volutaria tubuliflora totally matches what we thought was canariensis. So we had the wrong species all along here. And here's some great pictures of the plant that they took, and it now made complete sense as to why Gerhard Wagenitz misidentified the flowers, because the flowers of them look very similar. And in the US, for some reason, we have this white flowered form of tubuliflora. At its home range, it's mostly purple. There are occasionally a few white flowered morphs found in North Africa. But for the most part, if you have a Volutaria and it's a white flower, it's canariensis. But we have this unusual, fairly rare white morphed Volutaria tubuliflora. So it makes complete sense why Gerhard Wagenitz missed on his identification. And we all believed him because he's the expert. So now we knew we had this right species. And so it took us several years to figure out what that name was. Our identification was slow. So but once we had this identification, we were finally able to start rolling. So again, I had a green check mark for identification, but we were wrong, and we were very wrong. But now we're on the right path. We know what the species is. So in 2016, this was the season after it was discovered for the fourth time, possibly in Newport Bay. Several thousand plants were pulled from the sites, and we had several dozen populations that were scattered and scouted in Borrego Springs. California Department of Food and Agriculture listed this plant as a Q rating, which means that it's kind of like a temporary placeholder until they can figure out how invasive it is. And then in 2016, Jessie Vinci, who's a rare plant botanist in Southern California, found a new population of Volutaria when she was searching for other rare plants in Chula Vista, which is about 60 miles from Borrego Springs. So this is another huge red flag. But what we learned was that Volutaria has the ability to spread and spread widely. So now in 2016, we finally have the story of where we have population in Newport Bay, another population in the desert in Borrego Springs, and a third population near the city of San Diego. 3 very different habitats. One, I mean, literally, within 50, 40 yards of the beach. Another one in the desert where it's regularly 115, 120 degrees in the summer. And a third population in kind of sage scrubby type habitat growing in. So we finally put everything together. Did we get reporting done? Eventually in 2016, we finally got the report, but we had collected herbarium samples in 2011. It took us 5 years. That's really slow. In 2016, Henry Duracco and I finally set up some herbicide trials to learn how to control it in Upper Newport Bay because it was starting to get out of hand. And that year, volunteer crews started to pull several thousand plants in Newport and in Borrego Springs. So we kind of skipped ahead the risk assessment and practicality assessment, and we went straight to management. Let's just start pulling this thing out of the ground, which in hindsight may not have been the best option, but when the plant was there and was like, oh my God, this seems like it's a problem, let's get on top of it. So now in 2017, Ron Vanderhoff, who's an invasive plant volunteer extraordinaire, was looking through some of Bob DeRuff's online pictures from the Upper Newport Bay, and he saw this picture of a plant that Bob identified as Centaurea muricata. And this is our Volutaria tubuliflora. So Bob at least was able to take this picture, and we identified it through the picture through Ron's hard work. And then we went back to Bob DeRuff's herbarium specimen, and we were able to see that it was Volutaria tubuliflora. And we were able to finally learn in 2017 that Bob's note on the voucher says he saw it in 1987. So it took us 30 years from the time Bob first saw this plant to be able to properly put a name on it and properly locate it. So in that 30 years, the plant probably was first invading in Newport and then spread to Borrego Springs. So had we had that time machine in 1987, Bob and a small crew of people probably could have been able to get on top of it, but we didn't have that. So this is a case of not early detection or maybe early detection, but then multiple other non-early detections in Chula Vista and in Borrego Springs. And we definitely didn't have a rapid response. And so again, once we had all this together, we could look at that population in Chile, and we could see that our white-flowered Volutaria tubuliflora matches their white-flowered Volutaria tubuliflora. So for some reason, in the Atacama Desert of Chile and in the coast and desert of California, we have the same white-flowered variety, which is super interesting. So now the whole story finally all comes together. In 1987, Bob DeRuff finds what he misidentifies as a Centaurea, which is Volutaria. He vouchers the specimen 16 years later. 7 years later, Tom Chester and Larry Hendrickson independently see it, but don't know they independently see it. In 2011, Gerhard Wagenitz accidentally misidentifies it. In 2014 and 2015, it was relocated in Newport Bay. In 2015, the Spaniards let me know that we probably have the wrong name, and Wagenitz confirms that it's the tubuliflora. Then Jesse finds an additional population in Chula Vista. Then Ron Vanderhoff discovers Bob DeRuff's website, and then we figure out that it was actually in Newport Beach first in the 80s. Then we talk to the Chileans, and we know that they have the same species and we have the same species. And finally, it gets an A rating in CDFA. This is not how early detection and rapid response works, but this is what happened. This is the real world, and we're living in it. So you can see we've got a couple of good green check marks, and then we have a whole bunch of, oh, we thought we knew what we were doing, and we cross out those check marks. And these things did not happen early or rapidly. So looking at the spread of Volutaria now, We go from 2017, where I left off with the CalFlora maps. 2018, you can see we really expanded our mapping effort and we found a ton of new plants. 2019, we kept continuing our mapping efforts and we started to find new plants growing on the sides of roads out towards the Salton Sea and Borrego. And then in 2023, you can see the current population. There's multiple populations in Imperial County near the Salton Sea. There's a large growing population off of S22 outside of the town of Borrego Springs and Anza Borrego Desert State Park. And so this is starting to really spread. In addition, 2 populations were found on the 86 in Riverside County in this spring, partly because we had a lot of rainfall, but this seed must have accidentally moved. So, and on top of that, we found several new populations in San Diego County. It's moving south of Borrego Springs and west of Borrego Springs. A new population was found near Ramona. A new population was found out by Chula Vista at the Rancho Hamul Ecological Reserve. So again, we're starting to see that this thing is becoming a problem and we can almost predict where it's going to be. So did we have EDRR for Volutaria? No, we missed the ball by at least 30 years on this thing. So what are we trying to do now in Newport Bay, where we have a small population? The goal is eradication. In San Diego at the Chula Vista population, the goal is eradication. In Borrego, there's millions upon millions of plants. So we're trying to contain it, looking at those sites on roadsides where we can try and keep it from spreading. In Imperial County near the Salton Sea, those populations are small and manageable. And same thing with the population in Riverside County. So I think I showed how many different ways EDRR can fail. You can have very few people looking for it. It can be hard to find. It can take time to identify it. There can be an unknown chain of command, how to report this. It could be an unusual species like Volutaria, where there's not a lot of papers published on it. You might not know how to control it, or the treatments might not work. So I don't want to leave you hanging on this, this potentially spreading, or it is spreading, potentially problematic species. So I want to shift focus to 2 other EDRR species where we do have some success. So hopefully you'll leave this talk with a little bit of hope. So we have garlic mustard. It's a biennial plant, which is somewhat unusual for Southern California. This is a weed that is highly invasive in the eastern US. It is becoming a common weed in riparian forests. It is relatively unknown in the southwestern US. It is the closest known infestation is in the Pacific Northwest or in Utah. That being said, the first population of it was discovered in Southern California in the mountains behind San Bernardino in 2020 during a survey sponsored by the US Forest Service. It was found along 2.5 miles of a little creek called Hook Creek, and it's both on private and forest service properties, and it's growing very dense. In 2020, this was the only known population of garlic mustard in California, but in 2022, a population was also found in Trinity County. This is what it looks like in Southern California. One handful of pulling this, you can dig up, in one handful, you can pull up about 20 plants. It just grows in this amazingly dense forest of garlic mustard. And here's the seedlings. The seedlings are just amazingly dense. So did we have good education and scouting? Kind of, but not really. But we had good detection. It's relatively easy to see these huge, thick, dense patches. It's easy to identify. We had good reporting. It is on the noxious weed list. It is an A rating. We had a pretty good assessment of it. We are managing it, and we are checking how well our management's working. And so far, some of our garlic mustard populations have been declining in Southern California. Here's another weed that we have in progress, Stinking Roger. It's this little Asteraceae. It is native to South Africa, but it is also invading in Australia. It's sometimes called bone seed bitu. It was first reported in Laguna Beach in 2022. And this is another Ron Vanderhoff weed. He was surveying for a different weed species and saw this plant he didn't recognize. He collected it, sent it to the herbarium, and was able to take those vouchers to sunflower family experts, and we were able to correctly identify it. It is known in one site in Laguna Beach. And it also occurs in a fuel break where they're trying to make sure that many of the houses in Laguna Beach are safely protected from wildfires. So it's in a site that is actively being weeded and managed every year, which is a problem because we want them to keep the fires at bay if there is a wildfire, but we don't want them to spread this new A-rated pest from spreading throughout Southern California, because we know it grows widely in Australia, or can grow widely in Australia. So for Stinking Roger, we had really good education in scouting. It's just on a couple of acres at this site in Laguna Beach. Ron was able to detect it relatively quickly. We got a quick identification. CDFA has listed this as a noxious weed. We've done a partial risk assessment for the species. We'd still like to do more, but we at least know that it is a weed in other areas of the world. We have been doing a good job of managing it. Populations this year have not gone to seed, which is great. And we know that, it's a little too early to determine how well our treatments are working, but at least this year we're getting on top of it. So wrapping up here, what can you do? Try your best not to move plant parts around, whether those seeds or fruits or things like that, and definitely clean up. Please clean your hiking shoes after you go for a hike, or your pants. Camping equipment is another way that the seeds of invasive species can spread, or your pets. If your dog accidentally gets a couple of seeds in their fur and then you bring them home, now you've got an invasive species in your yard. If you work with, if you're a land manager, clean up your equipment. So tools, tractors, mowers, things like that. You can also volunteer at your local preserve. I know many local preserves are always looking for volunteers to pull weeds. It's one of the things that people don't volunteer for. And there is a website called the Play Clean Go website, which details a lot of more things you can do. And so with that, I want to thank you for attending, and thanks for listening to my long winding story, but I hope it all came together for you here. And I just want to thank all of the people who have made this story of Volutaria possible. Even though I'm the one speaking today, it's really a huge effort from a lot of people. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Chris. That's quite a story. But I'm glad we're ending on a bit of a positive note for EDRR. And it is very sobering about Volutaria, since you know that Calypsy has hopes of trying to not only work on the eradication of those outlying populations, but the containment of the big Borrego Springs population. So it's great to have that background. You really filled in some holes for me. Julie, what sorts of questions do we have from folks? And people, remember, put your questions type them into the Q&A on the Zoom.
We have a few, Doug and Chris. The first question is, IPM is important, but is it effective for eradication or more for controlling invasive species on the smaller scale?
So IPM can be done at any scale, whether it's a large scale or small scale, but oftentimes IPM isn't very effective for these new emerging invasive species, partly because one of the tenets of IPM is stacking these treatments, whereas in early detection and rapid response, you want to go with the most effective treatment as soon as you can possibly find it. So while, like, let's say if you had 1,000 acres of yellow star thistle, while you might want to have a prescribed fire, and then you might want to do some livestock grazing, and maybe you'll do some mowing as well. For the very first population of a highly invasive weed that you have that's new to North America, or new to your preserve, or new to the state, you want to kill all of those plants as fast as possible. And that might not be done with goats or with livestock. You might need to use herbicides or mowing or hand pulling. So that's where they differ.
Does EDRR take into account that a weed has expanded its range because it has some ecological utility related to climate change, such as food for pollinators that have migrated to cooler or warmer climates?
So most often, the plants that those pollinators or the wildlife has evolved with are generally better food or hosts, or better forage for those species. So it is pretty rare for an invasive plant to be better habitat than the native plants that those wildlife have evolved with. And most often those invasive plants cause harm to more organisms than they help. So while some invasive plants might be good for a few bees, they might not be good forage for butterfly caterpillars. And if the butterfly caterpillars can't eat the leaves of the weeds, then we don't get butterflies. So it might help a couple of bees, but it might harm way more butterflies. So usually on the grand scheme of things, those invasive plants are usually much more harmful than the native plants that they are replacing, which is why we get rid of them, the invasive plants.
Let me interject just for a moment. I realize we're getting close to the end of the lunch hour. I know that Chris is available to stay on and keep answering questions. So I encourage anybody who's interested in continuing the conversation to stick around for a few minutes after one. But if you need to go, that's of course totally appropriate. Randall did put the link for a post-presentation survey in the chat. So if you're able to take a second and fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. So with that, Julie, what other questions do we have from folks?
I'll stay, I'm going to try to stay on themes here, so it's easier for Chris to answer. So we have a couple of more EDRR related questions. Do you use iNaturalist with regard to EDRR?
Yes, iNaturalist is a great, and that's a whole nother talk about how many EDR plants have been found using iNaturalist. Somebody's out in the field, they snap a picture. They don't necessarily know what the plant is, but iNaturalist has an algorithm that kind of helps the picture, it helps attach a name to the picture. And so you can kind of get a sense of what that plant is. And especially if it's something common like garlic mustard, iNaturalist will do a pretty good job of getting it to the right species. And if it's something that's rare and unusual, then at least we have these pictures. So yeah, many of our new EDRR populations that are currently being discovered are from iNaturalist, people posting on iNaturalist just saying like, I don't know what this is. Can somebody help me? It's a really powerful tool.
What about other participatory science formats to employ, like with EDRR?
iNaturalist is one of the ones that most people tend to use, so it works really, really well. But there are others out there like CalFlora that can work as well.
And somebody's asking about what to do with how to report something that's found on their property. This particular questioner has an insect, a bug that has been collected that seems to be new the last few years.
So if there's something new on your property, whether it's a plant or an insect or maybe even some sort of plant disease, contact your local ag commissioner's office. And they will often accept samples. And if they can't identify the common pests and issues in your county, then they will send the sample off to Sacramento to have the experts identify it at CDFA. So yeah, send those samples in to the ag commissioner. Almost every single ag commissioner I've worked with is always happy to receive your samples. And even if it's something that's new to you, but is a relatively common pest, they'll be happy to tell you that it's not something that's brand new to California, but is, something that's just new to you.
And let me just reinforce that. It's a bit of a misnomer that each county has a county agricultural commissioner's office, and they do all sorts of things. And just because it says agricultural doesn't mean that if you have some other pest species or something you're confused about, that they're not the people to go to, because they are the people to go to. And they are closely related with the state's Department of Food and Agriculture, which has an herbarium and experts in identifying insects, plants, all sorts of things. So that's kind of the go-to ID source. So I agree
Yeah,
with
they're your
Chris.
local
Yep.
source.
Yeah.
This is an IPM question. Asking you, Chris, for advice about balancing in assessing a problem, when to determine pesticide use, whether leaving the invasive pest alone.
So
So
it'll,
just how and what kind of criteria do you use for assessing what IPM tools to use?
and so it depends on the scale of the infestation. Like, if you have less than an acre of a new weed, then you can use a lot more tools. But if you have something on the scale of 100 acres or 1,000 acres, there's not a lot of tools that scale up that large. So it depends on how aggressive the weed is. Do the seeds blow in the wind, or do they roll off the parent plant? Are they easily attached to animal fur, like our rabbits or squirrels dispersing it around? So it can vary widely between, where it's a small population, and even in the biology of the weed as well. If it has long, deep roots, and so if you pull the plant at the ground level, it snaps and it just resprouts, then you need to use a tool that can get down to those roots and kill the roots. Versus if you had goats grazing shrubs, then maybe they'll be able to do a better job, or maybe herbicides will be able to get down to those roots to kill the roots.
A question related to ingestion of invasive weed seeds by grazing animals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I'm
not transport by fur, but by transport.
Yeah, by eating those weeds.
Mhm.
So I'm not a livestock expert, but I know enough that there's been a couple of studies out there where people have actually fed goats and sheep and cows weed seeds, and then, because we're scientists, we do weird things, and they collected the fecal material and then grew it to see how many weed seeds would grow. And while many of those seeds are killed during the digestion process, it's not 100%. And in some cases, it's not even few. In some cases, many of those seeds, hundreds of those seeds, will be viable. So if livestock are in an area where there's weeds, it's usually best to put them on a weed-free diet for 72 hours so they can pass all of those weed seeds out of their gut and onto the ground before they move to a clean, uninfested area.
Another participatory science question. Are you familiar with the application Seek to report sightings, since it uses iNaturalist?
I have not used Seek, but some of my colleagues have been telling me about it, and they've been saying that it works really well. So I don't have firsthand experience with it yet. But this is actually the second time this week that Seek has been brought to my attention. So I'm definitely going to need to check it out.
Another questioner asked for can legality of removing invasive plants when a person is on public lands?
So regardless of where you are, you need to have permission of the landowner to be pulling those weeds, even if they are an A-rated noxious invasive weed. On public lands, generally you could be working with the preserve manager or with whoever the agency is. But yeah, if you want to go out to public lands and pull weeds, there's often a friends of group, so friends of the local forest or friends of the national park or something like that. And they are often more than happy to have weed pulling volunteers help out in areas. So yeah, you just need to get permission, but we can often get lots of people to tree planting days. It's much harder to get people to come out for weed pulling days. But if the the weeds are out there, then they can cause those trees that get planted to not survive as well. So we need both sides of the coin to make restoration work.
And somebody's asking for advice about photo documentation and some tips you would give in order to convey the right types of plant parts and or body parts if it's a non-plant.
Oh, great question. I didn't have a lot of time to go over this during my talk. Photos from your phone are usually sufficient enough, and you'll need 3 to 4 pictures. So one of the whole plant, kind of like Doug has a rundo behind him. So that's a good whole plant picture. And then a second picture of the leaf close up. And it's really great if you're holding that leaf, so we can get a pretty good sense of what the scale of that leaf is, because, you know, hands are relatively standard size. So you can tell if a leaf is 2 inches versus 12 inches if you're holding it in your hand. But if you have a leaf against like a somewhat, you know, blurry background, it's hard to tell sometimes what that leaf size is. So that second picture will be a close-up of the leaf, and try and get the leaf relatively flat if you can. Then the third picture is a picture of the flower. And again, another close-up picture of that flower. And if you can be holding it in your hand, that's great, because you can use the scale of your finger to figure out whether if that flower is 3 inches across or is less than 1 inch across or even less than 1/4 inch. So picture of the flower with your hand. And then if possible, if that plant is fruiting, also another close-up picture of the fruit. And again, using your hand as a scale is another great way to be able to figure out if that fruit is 2 inches long or 6 inches long. So, and I do understand that sometimes some plants are not in flower and in fruit at the same time. So you might only get 3 good pictures of the plant. But yeah, if those 3 to 4 good pictures of the plant, any decent botanist can get pretty close to what that species is. And if it's new to North America, then we might have to reach out to an expert in South Africa or wherever to figure out exactly what that species is. But that gets us really close.
Question about the Trinity County population of garlic mustard. Do you know if it's being treated?
I do not know. I heard a rumor that it might be, but I don't know if that's true. So if anyone's in Trinity County here, it would be great to reach out to, I think it's on Forest Service property, to check to see if they're working on it.
And thank you again, Chris. That was quite a presentation, and we're privileged to have a chance to hear from your expertise. So yes, a reminder, there is that survey, and then there is tomorrow's lunchtime webinar on invasive species in the San Francisco Bay and estuary. So please join us for that. And if you can find a place to volunteer pulling plants locally for part of Invasive Species Action Week, that would be great. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your Thursday. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.